As much as I like the Spiral Abyss and Stygian Onslaught, Imaginarium Theater has always been my favorite endgame mode. That's no secret, anyone who has heard me speak about these modes before probably knows that. Although the Abyss is a timeless classic, and Stygian's conditional tests are unlike anything seen in the other modes, I find the combination of full character choice freedom as well as the lack of sacrificial stakes to be less compelling. The team building and conditionals are themselves a challenge, that's true, but the end choices are all yours all the same. Sure, you may have to play to their conditions, but you are playing the game you want to play. Theater, by contrast, removes that design philosophy completely. You don't get to play the game you want to play, you have to play the game they want you to play. At least when it comes to character selection agency, which in Theater is removed twice over. Once by reducing the selectable characters down to 3 elements, with only a handful of off-element characters being able to join the cast, and twice by not allowing the selectable characters to be freely chosen, instead putting them into a semi-random selector, where the player is forced to draw them in order to put them into the playable cast. This dual restrictiveness and RNG serve to ask one question. If we removed your agency to choose and put all your stuff in a blender, would you have the coverage to still complete the challenge that we've laid before you? Of course, the challenges are all tailored towards the 3 elements of the current theater. The purpose of that being, anyone can have a deep account with a lot of characters, but if the majority of your characters fall under a few elements, and you lack characters of other elements, then you're going to find things to be difficult. Players with a balance of elements will have the most success. But Theater's functionality only holds up as much as it respects its own philosophies. That is to say, no longer just testing putting your characters in a blender and seeing how far you can go. And if you've played the June 2026 Imaginarium Theater, then it's possible that you've felt exactly that. I full cleared lunar mode on the June 2026 Theater, 12 Stella Flowers and all. Just as I've always done, I've a perfect lunar mode record. But man, it felt really tight. It's a trend that's been slowly creeping though. Every theater feels just a little less forgiving. Less random bullshit go, and more better assemble the full Avengers. But why? What's behind this trend, and what specifically about the June 2026 theater makes it all apparent? I think there are 2 pillars to this, one being an abstraction of the other. First, we can look at the symptoms themselves to find out what's wrong, and from there look at the origin of those symptoms to determine the larger systemic illness. Let's start with the elements. Pyro, of which there are 18, Cryo, of which there are 18, and Geo, of which there are 14. You can add 1 Pyro or Geo if you mod the Traveler into their elements as well. Also, we're getting Lowen soon, so you can add 1 to Cryo, and make it +2 if you have Aloy. With Traveler and Aloy, that's 52 characters, and with Lowen, it's going to be 53. But wait, there are also a few others to consider, the off-element special guest stars. There's Hydro 4-star Aino, Hydro 5-star Kogami, Electro 4-star Fischl, and the brand new Animal 4-star Prune, for a max selectable roster of 56 characters, 57 characters after Lowen. Now, it takes 28 minimum to start lunar mode, but 32 is strongly recommended because every character you add past 28 grants additional power. So you'll need to use roughly 49 to 56% of available characters, roughly half give or take, to get your best shot at a full clear. On the surface this sounds pretty generous. Half of your characters could be below the level threshold to join and you'd still be able to participate. But that's just participate. Because, you see, this roster is deceptively smaller and more restrictive than what it appears. Often the hardest thing about theater and what separates a 12-flower finish from the rest is knowing how to allocate the precious off elements for that season. and this theater was particularly brutal because the own elements are Geo, Cryo, and Pyro. If you've followed the game for the past year, you'd have noticed some interesting design choices. A resurgence of Freeze with Skirk, Lunar Reactions, Hexarai, all great. But to rewind, two of these team cores require a specific element, Hydro. Freeze and Lunar crystallize in this theater's case. Skirk and Escoffier looking for a Hydro enabler, Zabai, Linnea, and Itlua thirsting for just a drop. Those core teams are pretty much feast or famine without a splash of Hydro to bring them alive. It's not hyperbole to really just say they barely function at all. And yet, these are two very strong team bases that have inflated the Cryo and Geo rosters over the past year, and thus should have some expectation of use in Theater. You can't just add characters to the game, increase the character count in a new mode, but not count the characters. Every character here is a factor in determining eligibility and potential success. So where does that leave the Skirk Freeze Core and Zabai Lunar Crystallize Core teams? Well, there are two Hydros available, Aino and Kokomi. But this is where things become even more apparent. You have two Hydro characters to share across a Skirk Freeze Core and Lunar Crystallize Core, with not a single Vigor point to spare or other Hydro character to fall back on. What this essentially means is that if you do want to attempt assembling both the Skirk Freeze and Zabai Lunar teams during this run, you will need to 1. Draw both Aino and Kokomi during the run, 2. Draw one or the other in time to use either team core needed at the moment, 3. Never double up on Hydro if you plan to use both team cores twice, and 4. Have access to both Aino and Kokomi in the first place. Now, to be fair, everyone does have Aino, or at least can get her. She's freely given. But it's possible to not have Kokomi, and even with Aino, you may own her, but if you haven't pulled her, then we're talking C0. Either way, even in the best case scenario that you own both, that's 4 max uses. Which sounds good, but again, you need to have teams set up before you need them. This is why looking ahead at bosses is crucial in Theater. Had I not particularly saved a full Cryo and Hydro team for Stage 8, including my Escoffier and Skirk, I don't see any other way I'd had gotten the Stella Flower on this stage, seeing as I finished with 2 seconds left on the clock. Everything right. Skirk, her best in slot teammate Escoffier, only Hydro and Cryo teammates to maximize their bonuses, still came down to the wire on that stage. Wild. In a mode where assembling random teams out of a blender is the name of the game, playing a fully functional intended team should provide extra cushion. Rather though, it served as a baseline to barely skate by with the highest mark. To a similar point, Stage 10, which required Geo, a team of Zabai, Linnea, Aino, and Kokomi, with Linnea on Obad of Morning Star, and Aino on Silken Moon to maximize set usage. Both Hydro guest characters for maximum application, plus Linnea. Certainly this team, with one of, if not the highest damaging DPS characters in the game, would easily pass with flying colors, and yet a last-second victory. As for why I point these two battles out, it just illustrates the point for you. The point not being that the battles themselves were crazy hard or anything, but rather to show how important it is to play Skirk Freeze and Zabai Lunar with an actual core in the higher echelon stages. I played a reasonably competent Skirk team. She had her best in slot, and while Aino isn't the best applicator for this team, she offered the Hydro. Ganyu ensured it was locked into Hydro and Cryo only. In Zabai's team, I gave her one of the strongest premium supports, plus both Hydro applicators available. With the exception of subbing one of the Hydros out for Itlua, you couldn't ask for a better team. Because this is literally both of the Hydros, it's as good as it gets. As for why I didn't use Itlua here and opted for both Hydros, it's because this boss moves around so much that it's hard to get a good lock on consistent Hydro application. More hydro uptime felt more valuable here than more raw damage. And on the note of Aino and Kokomi, as for how I had both available for stage 10, it's because I was able to use Yabai and Linnea without them on stage 9 thanks to hydro slimes. It is the one saving grace stage for Yabai, where you can use her and not dip into the hydro supports, but it's a good thing cause if I had to drop a support on stage 9, I don't think I'd had the hydro application needed for stage 10. But to reiterate, that's the point. Not that the battles themselves were hard, but rather to say, if I used these cores with fully competent teams and they still barely passed with max marks, then without their core team components, you can only conclude that it wouldn't have been enough. Which, to be completely fair, I did have Pyro Traveler in my Skirk, Kokomi, and Shinha team on stage 6. And I did pass stage 6 with max marks. Barely, with 8 seconds left, but it is also stage 6, not the highest echelons. Just 2 stages later on stage 8, I had an actual Cryo and Hydro only team, with a Escoffier added, and passed it with even less time than I passed stage 6. See how the scaling works in this mode? Though to dial it back, I need to make it clear what I'm arguing here. I'm not saying this theater was troublesome because Skirk Freeze or Yabai Lunar were necessary to complete it. I'm not even suggesting these two teams were critical to get max marks. There are plenty of competent characters and cores aside from these. You have Mavuika on the Pyro side, Navia for Geo. As said, there are over 50 characters that can be used, and you at the very minimum need 28, 32 max. These core teams I mentioned are not necessary in the strictest sense of the word, but they do matter due to the mode's ecosystem all the same. Because Skirk exists, Escoffier, Yabai, because you do have Linnea and Itlua, they count towards the roster of selectable characters, and if these are your best invested characters, then it strongly matters because now you must aim not only for them, but their component core teammates as well. Contrast the Skirk and Yabai cores to say, Navia. She's a much more open-ended Geo unit who invites a wide variety of characters and elements to fight alongside her. Geo allies? Check. Pyro allies? Check. Cryo allies? Check. Heck, even the Hydro guest stars if you really found a fight to justify it. One further, even Fischl, the lone Electro guest star. Navia clearly has best in slot allies in the game, sure, but she's not so rigid that various mixed elemental comps can't get the job done, nor is she assigned allies that make her feel scuffed without them. Because Skirk and Yabai cores do heavily lean on Hydro though, and Hydro is a mere guest element with minimal vigor to spread around, it's a different story for them. The whole blender idea is supposed to be that if your best DPS is Navia, or Yoimiya, or whoever, that you have a shot. And that's why, again, I acknowledge there are people who have likely completely aced this theater without even using a Skirk core or Yabai core. It's not that they're necessary. But if you have them and they're a part of your account's lineup to bring into this mode, you have much more of a team assembling job to do than, say, with a character like Navia. No doubt there are clears without them, but for others, these are the characters they have. Which brings me to the higher order illness that this is really circling around. The team cores, the hydro scarcity. It's all symptoms of a larger systemic disease, and it's one I've talked at length about before. These increasingly rigid pathways through theater are directly tied to one simple gameplay trend over the past couple of years: component characters, component team design, and the bosses that accompany them. I put out a video last year where I introduced the concept of a component character, as it was an emerging trend at the time not just in Genshin, but in various games including Wuthering Waves and Honkai Star Rail. To refresh just what a component character or team is though, I define them as a character whose entire conceptualization is for a predetermined team. Nuance, that's different than niche, as a niche character is one with a particular role in mind, sure, but they aren't conceptualized from the ground up for a predetermined team that will fall apart without them. I think a good example of niche is Shinha. She exists to buff cryo damage, but she doesn't belong to and wasn't conceptualized for any cryo team in particular, nor does any team fall apart without her. They're just stronger with her. A component character or component team is by comparison one who was made from the ground up to function in a team. Sometimes in a pairing, but often with 3 or even 4 characters total rounding out the team. Some of their defining traits are: 1. They release in close timing to one another, implying a team or meta around them as components. I better pick this character up now if I want to play my favorite character next patch, otherwise they're going to be scuffed. 2. The synergy is so good that it could almost be considered trolling not to have them for the team. At best it's suboptimal, but at worst it's actually a bad team without the components. And 3. The team becomes shill flavor of the month, heightening the need to own all components. Sometimes even after the flavor of the month shilling ends though, the team remains so strong that they are now a staple for the foreseeable future. Worth noting that a character can be niche and have multiple use cases while still being component to a particular team. And a good example is Escoffier for Skirk's team. Escoffier and Skirk are both component characters for the Skirk Freeze team, but Escoffier can be used outside of the team. It doesn't mean she isn't a component for Skirk's team functionality though. The difference between an Escoffier-less Skirk team and one with her is massive. It's obvious Escoffier is component for the Skirk team because of the 3 points listed. All are true. The 2 characters came out back to back, have insane synergy, and have been the flavor of the month Freeze team since, like, for over a year now. If you want to play a Skirk team, you need the Escoffier component, as well as the Skirk component. And that's not even getting into the Hydro character requirement. Over the past 2 years, we've moved away from flexible, open-ended characters who can slot into almost any team, and toward component characters. And when you take a mode like Imaginarium Theater, built on randomness, improvisation, and putting your roster in a blender, and then you inflate the cast with characters who only function inside rigid pre-assembled team cores, you get exactly what we saw in June 2026. Not really a difficulty spike or overtuned bosses, but a fundamental clash of design philosophies between a mode that wants to throw your characters in a blender and have you do the best you can with what you have, versus character development where characters are meant to function inside of predetermined teams. The gameplay philosophy and character design philosophy are at odds with one another, and as more component characters and teams release, it becomes more and more apparent with each new theater as the roster is inflated with more characters that lack modular, slot anywhere you want designs. 2 years ago, character designs were more open-ended and modular. Again, look at Navia. Double Geo, double Pyro? Valid. Double Geo, 1 Cryo, 1 Pyro? Valid. Heck, she's even forward compatible. Navia with Linnea for lunar crystallized creation, Nicole is a pyro buffer, and a hydro applicator to make crystallize a reality? Valid. Her elemental combinations are plentiful, and on top of it, she's not looking for any one specific component ally. That's Navia though, one of the last characters of the open-ended character era. Throughout the past 2 years, we have received hyper-specific component characters looking for specific teammates and elements. Skirk begs for Escoffier, and both of them are greedy for Hydro and limit themselves to only Hydro and Cryo allies. A huge roster cut right there. Jabai badly wants Moon Sign activation and requires Hydro to function, and has component allies and characters like Linnea and Itlua. And again, Linnea is like Escoffier in that she may be a somewhat modular character herself that can function as a niche support outside of the team, but it doesn't mean she doesn't strongly help a Zabai component core all the same. And as for Itlua, he's absolutely a part of the core. It doesn't stop there though. Owning Nefer without Lauma is basically trolling. Over on the Hexerai side of things, you have characters like Durin and Nicole for Varka. But even as far back as Natlin, you could make the argument that teams such as DPS Malika was heading towards component design with clear-cut best allies like Shalonen as well as Sitlali, who was so shill as a Malika team component she released a cross from her banner. What? I'd like to turn your attention to my results from the very first theater. Look at that spread of characters. Granted, I did not get all Stella Flowers, but it was the first theater and I didn't make it a goal like I do today, where I retry stages over and over to get max marks. The point with these results is showing how ragtag the comps were though. Alhaitham, Kaching, Baiju, Yanfei, for the final stage? Insanely incoherent team. And yet, it worked enough to at least pass. But this was a time before characters began releasing as puzzle pieces to predetermined teams, a time when players themselves theory crafted on what the best teams were. Nowadays, we don't even have to guess. The next character release will be the current character's best in slot component, and on top of it, 95% of the rest of the cast will be shut out as alternative options. Taking a team as random as this one into a modern theater that is balanced around more rigid team designs will result in almost certain failure outside of the first 5 or 6 stages of the mode. There's a reason my results screen from the first ever theater looks so wild and ragtag. That's because it was. That was the point. Now if you look at my theater result screens, you see much less of this. You see actual team cores that for all intents and purposes would be the exact same team cores you'd expect to see in an Abyss or Stygian run, particularly at the highest stages of theater. Compounded by the fact that bosses and enemies release regularly now that also shield certain mechanics and cores. Lava Dragon Statue, Frost Knight Hera, Radiant Moon Gecko, and of course the infamous Secret Source Automaton Overseer device, still today considered to be one of, if not the most mechanically shield bosses in the entire game. These bosses appear in theater, which only adds to the feeling of better have X, Y, and Z character. As the roster of characters designed to work with each other has grown over the past 2 years, and as new bosses have released that strongly rely on particular mechanics, ragtagging is losing focus, while team building is gaining. Theater structure, thesis, its challenge is saying, here's your characters in a blender, make it work. In practice though, the challenge is slowly becoming, here's your characters in a blender, hopefully you've pulled their best components and allies, and if so, hopefully you have their team assembled by stage 8. That's just not the philosophy we had for this mode going into it upon release, and that's why the hydro scarcity this particular June 2026 theater was just a symptom of a much larger illness. We're putting pre-packaged meal ingredients from multiple different meal kits into a blender, and hoping when we pour it out, all the meal kits will pour nice and separately. That is why theater has begun feeling as rigid as it does, and that is why the June 2026 theater feels the way it does. And yet, all this said, if you want my honest opinion, it was actually my favorite theater yet. I know, I just indicted everything about this mode and modern component design, but genuinely, I loved this theater. It was so fun and exciting. I even had to rewind at one of the bonus stage choke points because I couldn't get the Stella Flower as it was, forcing me to reroute my Navia team and choose different characters. But I'm not blind to the design clashes here. My love for theater is actually relative to it. I look forward to theater more than Abyss or Stygian every month, but that's because I have like every character in the game except 9, and I'm not afraid to spend a little to secure them. Theater is incidentally my favorite because I have the necessary components to play the meta game. The fun of assembling teams, planning ahead, the sweaty uncertainty of praying for a specific character to show up, and the grit of rewinding. I have the characters to experience all of that. But the fun of assembling teams only exists if you have the characters to do so. The ability to plan ahead only exists if there's a path forward in the first place. The sweaty rush of relief when a component character shows up is only made possible by having the component. Rewinding is only an option if there are options to rewind for. And so, I enjoy it, I love it. This was my favorite Imaginarium Theater for sure. But if I liked it so much because it pushed my admittedly wide account to the brink, and even almost left me at a dead end, well then my heart truly goes out to others. The best compensation I can give to them is to just play lower tiers in this mode. Cause lunar mode, you can freaking forget it. Better gear up for Sandrone and superconduct.